Good morning. It's hard to believe that this is the very last lecture of the 99 series. The Hamilton Hall Board of Directors is most appreciative of the contribution that this lecture series provides. On behalf of the Ladies Committee, I want to thank all of you, sponsors and subscribers, for your continuing support and for bearing with us this year through our kitchen renovation. Partly because of the expense of bringing everything up to code, this project has represented a major investment of $100,000. We are extremely grateful for a very generous grant of $35,000 from the Fidelity Foundation, and we will be seeking matching funds for an additional $20,000 that they have offered. Information will be sent out to Friends of Hamilton Hall and other members of the community, offering an opportunity to respond to this request. Now I'd like to recognize the members of the Ladies Committee, without whom this lecture series could not take place. Their names are on the back of your program, and I thank each and every one of them for helping to make this series run smoothly, in spite of this year's distractions. Now, please don't forget to add names of those who might be interested in next year's series to the list on the table in the hall downstairs. I have just found out that the videotapes that have been done this year will be shown on Salem Access TV on Mondays at 8 and Thursdays at 7:30. And from time to time, there will be a list of these in the Salem Evening News. Before introducing our speaker, I have a message from last week's guest, Peter Salas. He neglected to mention that everyone must be sure to have an adequate supply of necessary medications on hand before January 1st, 2000. Oh, remember. His last note. Many of you will remember today's speaker from 2 years ago when he spoke on China, friend or foe. Robert S. Ross is professor of political science at Boston College and research associate and a member of the executive committee of the John King Fairbanks Center for East Asian Research at Harvard University. He received his BA in history from Tufts University and his PhD in political science from Columbia. He also received graduate training in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Ross has taught at and received research fellowships from Columbia University and the University of Washington. In 1994-95, he was Fulbright professor at the Chinese Foreign Affairs College. Professor Ross has been the recipient of research and collaborative project grants from a variety of foundations. He's a member of various professional organizations and research institutes, including the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Committee for U.S.-China Relations, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Professor Ross is the author of several major books on East Asia and has written numerous articles on Chinese security policy and U.S.-China relations. In addition to various collaborative projects, Professor Ross is currently writing a book on the rise of China and East Asian security, forthcoming from the Brookings Institution Press. Please welcome back Professor Robert Ross, who will speak on the geography of peace, East Asia in the 21st century.
Thank you very much. I really enjoy coming up here. When I think of the various different audiences I speak to, there's none I enjoy more than this one. I sometimes repeat myself, and today I'd like to do that again. I recall how I began my lecture 3 years ago by saying that it's an audience like this that reminds me that education is wasted on the youth. If I can use this expression and repeat it again and again, I will always be happy because I enjoy the audience. The title of the talk reflected my interest and I believe the importance of discussing the future. And yet the press of events often makes that difficult. When one picks up the headlines on a day-to-day basis and finds one new crisis after another, it becomes very difficult to say, what will the 21st century be like? So we don't know how we're going to get by tomorrow. And there are a number of issues that keep presenting the United States with these kind of pressing day-to-day events, and China is one of them. And I do want to discuss the future today. But I also want to try and put into context first the present. It's difficult to be a moderate in today's world, but that's how I like to think of myself. Because our political system pushes our debates to the extremes. And that's particularly the case when there's a vacuum in leadership. That's particularly the case when we move into our political season. And both are happening today. On one side of the spectrum, we see those positioning themselves for leadership. On the other side of the spectrum, we see those who are unsure how to exercise leadership, having been through a 2-year grueling process in the Congress. And I think, as a moderate, I would suggest that we see that in China policy. And one way to express that is to simply say, is anyone shocked that China spies on the United States? And should this influence our policy toward China? Well, no one's shocked. And if you read carefully what's happening here, we should be shocked that our security system is so lax. And there's enough blame to go around on this one that it ought to be a bipartisan dismay. Should we care about this major security lapse for U.S. policy toward China? Well, that's a yes or no question. And the yes or no is, well, to what extent did that security lapse affect China's ability to hurt America? Because that's what we care about. And it could be the worst security lapse in history, but if it affected Vietnam, well, no one cares. Right? Because Vietnam's not going to hurt us. If China didn't hurt us 2 months ago, then we only care whether this security lapse means they can hurt us tomorrow. And if their ability to hurt the United States doesn't change, then our policy doesn't change. And so one has to ask the question, what did they have before, and what do they have now, and what will they have in the future as a result of what they've gotten, and will it change anything? And the answer is no. It's no, because China's been able to target Los Angeles with its nuclear weapons for over 20 years. We've been living with that for a long time. They've got 20 missiles that can do it, and we've got 8,000 warheads that can hit them. If their missiles are a little more accurate, do we care? No, they aim for LA, and instead of hitting San Francisco, they're going to hit LA. It's not going to affect American security one way or the other. Do we care if they have little warheads so they can put 3 warheads on one missile? No, because they're still only going to have 30 warheads. It's the same number of warheads. In fact, if they're foolish, they'll put 3 warheads on one missile, because that makes it easier for us to target their warheads. You just need one missile to take out 3 warheads. There's no beef in this issue. What we care about is American security. And to use a term that's often used in my profession, we care about relative gains. We don't care how many missiles we have, we care about how many missiles we have relative to someone else's missiles. And so we care whether this change in espionage improves China's gain, not in their absolute technology, but whether it means they've improved compared to us. And that's really hard to do, because we truly are the most advanced, powerful country in the world. And if anyone thinks we're standing still simply because we won the Cold War, they're gravely mistaken. We have an aircraft carrier coming offline every year. Last year was the Harry S. Truman. The next one will be the Ronald Reagan. And these are the most advanced aircraft carriers in the world. And there'll be another one after the Ronald Reagan. We have 2 warplanes planned for the 21st century. China's major commitment in building warplanes is to buy them from Russia and their 1970s warplanes. We are the most powerful nation on earth, and we act that way. We bomb countries with impunity. I'm not going to say it's right or wrong. I will simply say it's with impunity, because no one can retaliate against us. Maybe it's right to bomb Serbia. Maybe it's not. But what is true is that we can do it with impunity. No one else has ever had that kind of power in your lifetime, and no one will have that kind of power in the future. And that's important to remember. The Chicago Council on Foreign Relations comes out with a poll every 4 years on American attitudes towards world affairs. If you poll Americans about what they think are the most pressing issues in world affairs, sometimes I agree with the sort of general wisdom of the people, and sometimes I disagree. And I can go through, find places I agree or disagree. And I think there's some wisdom when you ask Americans what the most pressing threat is. 7th or 8th is a particular country. There's no country out there that Americans feel we need to worry about. They worry about immigration. They worry about terrorism. They worry about drug trafficking as international problems. Number 7th is China. That's about where it belongs. And that's not changing with espionage. So the question, if we ask about China, and we ask about the long term, is what is this relationship? What is Asia going to be like? Do we have a new Cold War coming in Asia? And what is China's role? And I would first posit by saying that there are only 2 great powers in Asia. There's China and the United States. Japan and Russia don't count. We can recall the Cold War and the Russians in Asia, but we also have to look back and realize that the Russians never quite made it. You look at their Navy, you look at their Air Force in Asia, it never quite got there to mean anything. And it's a very easy reason for that. Vladivostok's, their only base in Asia, is a long way from Moscow. And in between, it's cold and barren. There's no food out there, there's no industry out there, there's no population out there, there's no infrastructure out there. How can you project power into Asia when you don't have a foothold in Asia? They could not overcome the geography of the weather. They've been trying for 200 years, and they still can't, and it's worse today. Japan has a different problem. Japan's small. Now that means 2 things. That means Japan will never be economically autonomous. This is a state that's dependent on the world's oil. It's dependent on the world's resources. What does that mean? That means if it makes enemies, it no longer has oil. That means if it makes enemies, it no longer has resources. That means it really can't make too many enemies and find itself in a war, because then it can't win. 1939, Japan got 90% of its military supplies from the United States. How are they going to win a war under those circumstances? They couldn't. The second problem with Japan is that it's small. And so how do you hide behind your strategic depth? You want to be secure for your wartime industries. You want to be able to prepare for that nasty world out there. You need to protect your economy, protect your resources, protect your industry. So what do? You move it toward the interior, so that if anyone comes to your shores, it's still difficult to hit your resources. Japan doesn't have an interior. It's a long, thin island. There's no strategic depth. There's no rear area. There's only two countries in Asia that have the ability to be economically autonomous and are big enough to withstand war. And that's China and the United States. The United States can pull its resources up to China's coast, but we're still unable to reach China's oil resources out there in the far west. Maybe some country will be able to reach across the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean, but if they do, they can't reach the industrial heartland of the United States in the Midwest. These are two big, powerful countries with autonomy and resources. We're the only two that count. Now, the second point here is, well, China's a rising power. It may be the only one that counts, but rising powers cause instability. Now, we in the ivory tower like to think that every so often we influence foreign policy, we can influence debates. One way we see that is the research on the democratic peace has now become part of our American dialogue, and we think that democratic nations can be more peaceful amongst each other. That comes out of research. Whether it's true or not is another story. But that is one way we influence the debate. The idea that rising powers create instability is something else that comes out of research in the academic community. And like anything, it's important to understand what the research argues and what it shows. Now, when we talk about a rising power, we don't talk about economic power. We don't care about economic power. We talked about Germany as a rising power. We talked about economic power because it made it powerful militarily. We talked about Athens and Sparta and the Peloponnesian Wars. Well, these are military powers, not economic powers. If we care about economics, we care about it because it creates military power. And we say that rising military power creates instability because a new power comes into the system and says, we want a share of this system that reflects our power. If you think of the international system as a pie, which you divide into sections, they're saying, we want to redivide that pie so we get a slice, or a bigger slice. And what that means is some other country is going to get a smaller slice, or no slice at all. And they're not arguing about a market in Afghanistan, they're arguing about allies, major allies, spheres of influence. They're arguing about military equality. And that's important stuff, and that's what leads to big wars. And so it's that rising power, no one's fault. It's not the rising power's fault. It's not the status quo power's fault. It's that simply big nations find it hard to agree over important things. And because they're important, they're willing to fight over it. And so this rising power gives rise to instability. Now, how does this happen? It happens in two ways. Either the rising power wants more power and more influence, and so it wants military equality. It wants to have the same number of missiles, the same number of battleships, and that means some other country that was superior has to accept equality. And that rising power thus elicit an arms race, as the pre-existing superior power says no and wants to keep its superiority. Or you have a competition for regional influence in which the new power wants to have a large sphere of influence. We call those allies, and the existing power has to give up an ally. Both dynamics lead to heightened tension. We tend to focus on China as a rising power in Asia, displacing America, competing with America for regional influence, taking away our allies, and we're going to have a problem as we compete for regional influence. So that's what I want to focus on next. What do we mean by China as a rising power in Asia? Well, the first thing you need to do is you have to know the baseline. Where is China today? How powerful is it? No one should think that this is not a powerful country. After all, we saw 58,000 Americans lose their lives in Vietnam, and without China helping Vietnam, without China in there, it never would have happened. 53,000 in Korea, and those were Chinese fighting directly. This is a powerful country. This is a country at the heart of the Cold War. It has to be powerful. And it is. It took China 40 years, 1949 to 1989, but China was the major victor in the Cold War in Asia. If you look around the region and you look at where the Soviet Union retreated from, every Soviet loss was a Chinese gain. The Americans did not gain, did not displace the Soviets to fill the Soviet vacuum. The Chinese did. The Chinese were the beneficiaries of the Soviet withdrawal. So what do we have when we look at the map? We have a China that dominates the security structure of mainland Asia. You walk around the perimeter around Asia, and China has the dominant influence in the security realm in nearly every country. North Korea, well, we all know it's a hermit kingdom, so it may not have much influence in North Korea, but it's got more than anyone else. Along the Sino-Russian border, again by default, the Russians can't shoot straight anymore, their soldiers aren't getting paid, their military industries are closing down, they have enough problem with their domestic minorities. China commands the conventional balance on the Sino-Russian border. Central Asia, well, those are nice little countries out there. If there's a competition between Russia and China in the great game of history in Central Asia, again, China has a military advantage and an economic advantage because its traders, its markets, its exports are things that the Central Asian countries want, and no one wants to buy anything made in Russia. Same thing with Mongolia. If you keep moving around the perimeter, we get to Southeast Asia. Burma has always been a de facto Chinese protectorate. Thailand moved over to the Chinese side when America abandoned Vietnam, and the Thais said, we may have an alliance with the Americans, but we can't depend on them, so they became a Chinese friend. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they were Soviet allies, it's now a Chinese sphere of influence. First the Chinese fought the French and defeated the French. They fought the Americans, they defeated the Americans, and then they defeated the Russians, and there's no one left. The Chinese command Indochina. There are exceptions. South Korea is an exception. It's an exception because it's the only place in Asia where America has a strategic foothold on the mainland. But even in South Korea, Chinese influence is important because the South Koreans and the Chinese can't agree over who dislikes the Japanese more. There is a common fear of Japanese power, and their two militaries see eye to eye and have much to talk about. And so the Chinese are happy because they see in South Korea a partner to deal with Japan. This is the basis of the contemporary strategic order in terms of Chinese power. What's American power? With exception, partial exception, of South Korea, America has no influence. I shouldn't say that. America is the secondary power and almost has no influence on the mainland of Southeast Asia, on Northeast Asia, anywhere on the mainland of Asia. We have economic influence in parts. We have a good, strong relationship with South Korea, that's the exception. But we are a maritime power in East Asia. Our friends, our allies, whether it's Japan, the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, they're all out there across the water. We're not on the mainland, and we're happy with that. Why? Because America's two most important interests are to keep Asia divided, right? That's what we want. We defeated the Germans in World War II, and we were happy to go home. No, because then the Russians took the German place. Because first the Germans, then the Russians threatened to dominate Europe. We don't care who it is, we want to keep Europe divided. World War II, it was Japan that threatened to conquer Asia. And after Japan, did we go home? No, because then the Chinese and the Russians threatened to conquer Asia, and so we had to stay to keep Asia divided. We want to keep Asia divided. And you can do that with a maritime presence, because Japan is a very powerful country, it's our ally, and we have bases in the region to enable us to project our power. Our second valuable major interest in the region is oil, which is in the Middle East. So we need to have those shipping lanes. And again, maritime interests do that. So what do we have? We have a regional order in Asia in which China's the dominant land power, and we're the dominant maritime power. It's already bipolar. We don't have to wait for the rise of China. America doesn't have hegemony in Asia. We are the world's only superpower. This is true. But that's not to say we are the only great power in Asia. That's a very different issue. There's more than one great power in Asia. The other one is China, and we share authority. Now, what would a rising China look like? It would look like a power that can move off the mainland, begin to project that power across water, and in so doing, challenge America's relationship with its vital allies in the region. It would mean that China develops sufficient power in maritime Asia to compel those countries that we think are our allies to accommodate themselves to Chinese power, because China is now more powerful, they're frightened of China, so they're going to accommodate China to keep it friendly. And in turn, we are essentially again talking about relative power. We're going to see a rise in Chinese capabilities, such that there is, relative to the United States, the Chinese are beginning to become an American equal. So we're not going to be counting how many ships, how many boats. We're going to be counting how many ships and how many boats compared to the United States. Now, whether China becomes a rising power in maritime Asia, thus is a large degree a function of the United States. Are we going to stand still while China develops? Or do we continue to grow as well, so that the status quo remains simply at a higher level of capabilities? And I would only suggest that current trends are promising. As I mentioned earlier, we have a new aircraft carrier coming online every year, and the Congress shows no inclination whatsoever to cut the defense budget, to the contrary. And when we went through our budget cutting in the mid-90s, we didn't touch the Navy. The Navy was sacrosanct, because it was understood that that is the basis of American power around the world. We are a maritime power. So we cut bases around the world, land bases. We cut our ranks, we cut the soldiers. So that's promising, too, that Congress seems to understand American interests. Moreover, insofar as China challenges the United States, we should be confident that America will see it as a challenge and respond. Why should we be confident? One, because there's no other power out there who China could be threatening. We know their power is directed at us. And so we're not going to make mistakes and think that China is really caring about Russia or caring about Japan. That happens sometimes. You misperceive who a country is targeting, so you don't respond well enough. But we're not going to misperceive. There's only one other power out there, that's China and us, and they're aiming at us. And second, we're not going to respond inadequately because we don't like China. Which means we focus clearly, we exacerbate any threat, we become alarmist, and so if anything, we're going to have unnecessarily bellicose responses, but we certainly don't have to worry about the Chinese catching up because of that. Now, in any case, what would China need to do? It would have to develop maritime power. What does that mean? China will have to develop aircraft carriers. It sounds old thinking to be talking about aircraft carriers in the age of high technology. But you got to have aircraft carriers. And yet they are very costly. The technology is the most advanced in the world, and you got to be able to manage it. But more than that, we are in the age of what's often called the revolution in military affairs. This is the information age being applied to the military. What does that mean? That means we have a revolution in technologies that enable us to find things around the world, other countries' assets, if you will, and then to have real-time targeting with that reconnaissance with our missiles. You can find it, you can track it, you can have real-time targeting with the missiles, and then hit them. That's one part of it. The other part of it is the ability to hide. This revolution in military affairs means that you have all these counter-electronic warfare measures, which means they can't find you. Both are part of this revolution in military affairs. And it's not clear that China has even begun to catch up. It may be falling behind. To give you an example, in March 1996, when we had a little crisis in there in the Pacific Ocean near Taiwan, we moved the aircraft carrier Independence within 100 miles of the Chinese shore, and the Chinese didn't know where it was. They couldn't find it because we were hiding. Now that's dangerous, mind you, because if they don't know where it is, maybe some people might think it's entering into Shanghai. and they're going to get really ready for war, and that could be dangerous. So we communicated with the Philippines on open line just to let them know where we were. That's what we're talking about when we say the revolution in military affairs. These kind of technologies, to be able to find others and target and fire, and to be able to hide from others. It's not clear they can do that. Nonetheless, begin to catch up. Okay, they're buying things from the Russians. They're buying Kilo submarines. These are not nuclear subs, they're diesel subs. Second of all, they can't even maintain these subs. They go back to Russia to get repaired, and none have seen action. They break down. They got a new destroyer from the Soviet Union. They got 2 of them. All the good will do them. 2 is not very many. They're buying Su-27s, 200 of them. The fact that the Chinese are buying 200 Russian Su-27s is an admission that they don't have the ability in the year 2010 to have their own aircraft. Because when you buy 200, you're making it the backbone of your military for the future. You're not buying them to learn about them, you're buying to defend yourself. And so it's an admission that they can't make their own to defend themselves, but they're buying Russians. And what is the Russian Su-27? It's a late 1970s aircraft. This is not something in which we see a rising power. So it's not all clear that China can afford to make a decision that ultimately will not expand its role. It cannot afford to make a decision to become a maritime power, because it's not at all clear that it will succeed. And that's a lot of money down the drain for something which has a low chance of success. That's especially the case when you look around the Chinese perimeter and you see some other major problems. Ethnic groups out there, Russia may not be a great power today, but how about in the future? India, you can't be too confident about. Little powers that may get big powers as allies. China, for the last 3,000 years of history, has been a land power, and for good reason. It's interesting to take a look and try to understand Chinese priorities. This is an arming, or say an armed forces. When they're done with their latest downsizing, will have 2.5 million people in it. 40,000 people in the Navy. Doesn't seem like a priority to me. Now, China's weak. It's backward. But can't they do some things that could immobilize the United States? Suppose they knock out our satellites. Suppose they hack into the computer system and blind us. That's the term people use. If they knock out our satellites, they'll blind the military, so we can't find our own ships, they can't find Chinese ships. If they hack into our computers, they'll take away our ability to communicate. Well, let's say perhaps. But the military has it. And so with that, what could they do? They'll blind us, and then maybe they'll take out an aircraft carrier. The military has expressions. One of the things they say, well, you can take out an aircraft carrier, but you only get 1 shot. And then we fire back. And then you just lost your Navy. You can't take out an aircraft carrier and think there's not going to be a full-scale war after that. And so the military has another expression. All right, you can knock out our eyes, you can knock out our ears, and that'll get you through the first day. But what are you doing the second, third, and fourth day of the war? That's a whole different issue. And then all you've done is level the playing field a little bit, and it's our planes against your planes, our ships against your ships, and they're going to lose. So when we think of China's advances in sort of narrow ranges of technology, what we're looking at is their ability to try and level the playing field a little bit if there's a war. What they're not doing is developing the ability to give them the confidence to start a war, to challenge our presence. That's a whole different capability. Now, that means I am very suspect that there is a rising power in Asia. I don't see it. They can't swim to Singapore. They can't send 50-year-old destroyers and expect them to matter. Does that mean the United States and China are going to be friends? No. Are we going to be strategic partners? Absolutely not. If China is the only other great power in Asia, we're going to look upon them with a high degree of suspicion. We're supposed to. That's our job. is to look out there in the world and say, where's the problem going to come from, if it comes? And that's China. It's clear that if it comes from anywhere, it's going to be China. Because it's the only great power in Asia that has a chance. You're going to leave out Japan, you're going to leave out Russia. And if the U.S. military and our strategic planners didn't focus on China, they would be remiss. You often hear about China as targeting the United States as the next adversary. Well, we're the most powerful country on earth. If any country could establish a land presence along China's borders, it would be us. If China didn't target the United States as the most likely challenger to its security in the 21st century, they'd be asleep at the wheel. That's their job. We are two great powers who are going to look upon each other with a high degree of suspicion and apprehension. That's normal. What does that mean? That means that there are going to be problems. Human rights is going to be different with China than with any other country. Trade issues are going to be different with China than any other country. Espionage issues are going to be different with China than with any other country. But it also means that this kind of great power relationship, in which the United States and China are adversaries, if you will, or great power competitors, is also one in which you can have a high degree of stability. And what do I mean by stability? I mean, what is the likelihood of an arms race, creating a high degree of tension and unnecessary defense budgets? What is the likelihood of crises, as in Cuba in '62, and the repetitive crises in Europe over Berlin in the 1950s and early 60s? And I would suggest to you that the likelihood is low, because China lacks the ability to challenge our interest in maritime Asia, and we really lack the ability to challenge their interest in mainland Asia. We have different interests, different capabilities. I mean, if you recall what happened in Berlin, every time there was a Berlin crisis, or a crisis over Poland or Czechoslovakia, and the Russians would become more active with their military forces, or they'd make a military probe, we were never certain if it was a prelude to a Russian invasion of Europe. We were right to be afraid, because if the Russians launched a massive invasion of Western Europe, we'd lose in the first 3 weeks of the war. We couldn't defend Western Europe on the ground. Why did we have a nuclear arms race? Because we knew we couldn't defend Western Europe on the ground, so the only way to deter the Russians was to threaten them with a nuclear holocaust. Both those issues don't exist in Asia. If the Chinese want to play around a little bit in the South China Sea, we're not worried about a massive Chinese naval invasion of Indonesia. So we can sit back and wait and see what happens. If we do a little probe in Thailand, the Chinese aren't worried there's going to be a massive American presence in Indochina. The next day, they can sit back and wait. There aren't going to be these kind of crises where you're on the edge of your seat to wait and see what happens next. And because of that, because the Americans aren't afraid of losing a war in 2 weeks, we don't need nuclear weapons. We can win the battle at the conventional level. And China doesn't need them, because 1.3 billion Chinese can deal with the Americans at the conventional level on the mainland. We're going to be great power competitors, but it's wrong to think of great power competitors as meaning a Cold War relationship. America's a fairly young country as a great power. We don't have much experience. The only experience we've ever had as a great power is a Cold War. But a glance through history shows that great powers can exist in a wide variety of ways. The French and the Germans on the eve of World War I were major trading partners. The French and the British couldn't stand each other for much of the 19th century, yet they had very close commercial and cultural ties. You can be a great power competitor and not be on the edge of your seat in a Cold War. And I'd suggest that's what we can have with China, and that is what we're likely to see with China. Mistakes can be made. America could go home. That would be a mistake. We could mismanage Taiwan. That would be a mistake. We could have a Congress that makes foreign policy with a weak president. That would be a disaster. Important to remember that when you have Congress making foreign policy, by nature of the institution, you're going to have 550 secretaries of state. And each one is representing their own district, because that's their job. They got to go home and represent the voters. That's the nature of the institution. And that's what we have now. But I only suggest that given the context, two great powers, big, strong, looking upon each other with a high degree of suspicion, the future is a fairly good one. Thank you. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
You spoke about managing the Taiwan relationship, and I was curious how we could accomplish that.
I do not see Taiwan as a major problem in the relationship. So that's why I mean mismanaged, rather than it being a source of inevitable tension. Let me explain why. General MacArthur, a long time ago, called Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier. He was right. What did he mean by that? It's a wonderful staging platform to bomb mainland China. Does that mean it's a vital American interest to be able to bomb mainland China? No. That means that if you have a major conflict with China, it's a good asset to have. That's different than having a vital interest in Japan, because Japan can start a major war or change the regional balance of power. America can live with a Taiwan that doesn't support us. And we've lived with that. Since 1979, we haven't had a single troop on Taiwan, and it's not part of the American security framework. That makes the mainland happy. They don't want to see anyone occupying an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Taiwan is the Cuba of the East. Why? Because as China is as sensitive about Taiwan 100 miles from its shore as America is about any country having a presence in Cuba 100 miles from Miami. And what has China accomplished through U.S.-China relations in the 70s and 80s? They got the Americans off of Taiwan. So what are we dealing with? We're dealing with face. Taiwan wants independence. That's a face issue. The mainland wants unity to end its civil war and proclaim victory. That's a face issue. We don't want to give them face. We're unwilling to take a long American ally and say, you have to cave into the mainland. We don't have to do that to Taiwan because we're very, very powerful. But the mainland is not willing to fight for that because they've got their security as just face. So as long as face issues are kept intact, this is an issue that can be managed. They won't go to war as long as they think Taiwan's not going to declare independence, and we're going to support them in that. And we have no reason to change the status quo because we don't have no reason to give Taiwan face. Not a single American should die so Taiwan gets in the United Nations. I mean, let's face it, we're ignoring the United Nations today. It's not that important. But we are willing to make a commitment to defend Taiwan's real independence, ability to govern itself, which is what it has today. So we're in a little diplomatic dance here. Taiwan's de facto independence, but we will not encourage it to have real independence unless the Congress takes over, which is what happened last time, and we had a little war. A little crisis, sorry. And the mainland's not going to go to war as long as America doesn't seem to be pushing Taiwan toward independence. Well, insofar as we don't care about independence, there's no reason we should be doing this. But we have a messy domestic political system where there's a lot of interest, a lot of congressmen who want to make political hay by selling weapons to Taiwan. Well, Taiwan can never, ever defend itself. It's 20 million people, right? Against 1.3 billion. There's no defense against Chinese missiles. You want to start a war, they'll rain missiles on Taiwan, and whether or not they occupy Taiwan or not doesn't matter. Taiwan loses because these missiles destroy Taiwan. So why do we sell weapons to Taiwan? Because it doesn't really matter. We sell weapons to Taiwan because we have interest groups that want us to. 2, because we can get away with it without the mainland getting angry. And 3, because Taiwan wants them because it says, made in America. We used to say to Taiwan, buy your weapons from France if you think it'll help. Buy it from Israel. They didn't want them from France or Israel. They wanted them from America. Because if arms sales are a way of expressing a strategic commitment to a country, saying, you're our friend. And by saying, we're Taiwan's friend, we do two things. We make them feel more secure against the mainland. And the second thing we do is perhaps we make them more secure to do things the mainland doesn't like declare independence. So the mainland says you can sell lots of weapons, but there are certain weapon categories you can't sell because they have such a high political profile that they feel can have a political impact to suggest greater American strategic support in kind, a whole new degree that could lead to a new Taiwan foreign policy, such as independence. And what are those weapons? Theater missile defense, submarines, Aegis destroyers. None of them are going to help Taiwan be more secure, so there's no reason we should do that, because there's no benefit. But those are the kind of arms sales, for example, that could lead to a crisis. Someone may decide that Lee Teng-hui visited Cornell, now he should visit it, now the Taiwan president should visit Washington. Well, we've got a real problem. Why should he visit Washington? Because he's a private citizen, he has the right to travel? Nonsense. No private citizen should have the right to travel if it creates a crisis and the likelihood of Americans losing their lives. It sounds good, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. You want to give something to Taiwan, you pay a price, and you pay a price in terms of a crisis. And I'm fairly stingy when it comes to expending American lives. So that's how it might happen. There's no reason for it to happen. We know the rules. We managed this very well from 1969 to 1992, or 94. No crises. Taiwan got what it wanted. We got what we wanted. Taiwan even got what it wanted, independence. We know how to do it. It's a question of whether we have a president who keeps his eye on the ball, keeps his eye on Congress to keep control of the policy. Our presidents are famous for turning their attention elsewhere. So. Any party. Yes.
What effect, if any, do you see the changeover in Hong Kong? How do you establish that?
At the bottom line, Hong Kong is a human rights issue. It's not a security issue. It's not even an economics issue. It's a human rights issue. And it's a human rights issue of a particular kind. If the Chinese marched in with the army and began beating people over the head, we'd have a crisis. But they're smarter than that. They know that there are certain nodes in a society you need to control in order to keep a handle on things. So you make sure the executive director of Hong Kong, their leader, is under your control. You make sure that the editorial board of certain newspapers are under your control. You make sure that certain leading businessmen, if they don't make investments where you want them, don't get contracts where they want them. You make sure that certain universities mold their curriculum in subtle ways to make them happen. And so you don't see this happen. You can't watch it happen because it's not a very good story for a newspaper. Newspapers like a story that's hard-hitting, that says something happened. But you can't report on these kind of things. But when you look 10 years later, oh my goodness, Hong Kong is different. You don't know when it happened, you don't know how it happened, but it's different. And it won't be nice. It won't be as nice in 10 years as it was earlier. We won't like it as much. But it will have happened peacefully and gradually until the impact is nil. Yes, sir.
How long will it take China to catch up?
If I had to bet on it, I'd say never. And why do I say never? Because in order to catch up, you need a straight line projection of continued economic growth, continued domestic stability, and the ability to focus your resources on foreign affairs rather than on your domestic problems. So then I ask, well, who's got a better likelihood of doing that for the next 100 years, the United States or China? I bet on the United States. We're talking about long-term trends. Who's going to find themselves in an economic collapse first so that their entire defense program is unable to develop? China and the United States. I bet that China will have that problem first. We sometimes think that the president of China wakes up every morning and says, how am I going to increase my power to throw the Americans out of Asia? That's the last thing on his mind. Number one is, what do I do about my urban refugee problem? I mean, we remember Mexico and Latin America in the 70s and 80s and the urban migration problem and the shanty towns. China's got on big time. It hasn't been a problem for China because the economy's been growing, so they may live in aluminum shacks, but they're making money and getting rich. What happens when the recession comes? You got a real problem. They worry about that. What do you do about a communist party that no one respects in the whole country? Because they're corrupt. You better get rid of corruption. What do you do about uneven rates of growth, so that some parts of China were growing 2 years ago at 4%, and the cities were growing at 20%. Well, that means if your overall growth rate's only 7% or 6%, Shanghai is growing at 10, but the other half of the country is in a depression. And that means your villagers out there start roaming the countryside as bandits looking for food. That's what they worry about. And they haven't solved these problems. What do you do about a banking system that's unable to make loans to any profitable industry in the whole country? Well, if the banking system can't make loans to profitable industries, where do the profitable industries get their investment capital to make the economy grow? That's what banks are for. That's a very good question. How are they going to sustain growth without banks? And they don't have banks. These are just some of the things he worries about. And they're going to have to solve these problems for the next 40 years while we develop real problems in the next 40 years for that gap to narrow. And I put my bet that we're able to manage our society better than they can manage their society. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You comment on the possible influence of India in this area.
You know, I don't worry about India. And I'll tell you why. You know, I've been accused of being a congenital optimist. And I don't, so you can see a lot of that today, right? I just don't worry that much. I've heard in India, Indians have a PR problem. They are the least socialized diplomats in the world. And I heard an Indian diplomat say, nothing's going to stop us now. We're going to have nuclear weapons. We're going to have missiles. And our objective is to have enough missiles and warheads to destroy Shanghai and Beijing. You think to yourself, this guy's nuts. What's he doing? And then you think a little further and you say, if the guy had a little more tact, he'd say, look, what we want is to have a minimum deterrent capability so that we feel secure so no country will be able to attack us with nuclear weapons. Well, that sounds reasonable. And I think they are reasonable. They just got a PR problem. And I can't see China worrying about India having 30 missiles. After all, they're living with America having 8,000 warheads. They're living with Russia having a similar number of warheads. A few more from India, I just don't see it. Now, dividing India and China are the highest mountains in the world. I mean, Switzerland is one of the most secure countries on earth. Who'd want to invade? Right? It's not a mistake that every time Germany invades France, they go around Switzerland through Belgium. Geography still matters. And those Himalayas provide a natural boundary. That the idea of these two countries becoming adversaries is unlikely. The sole exception is Pakistan. Pakistan is the only, if you will, country in South Asia that's not within the Indian sphere of influence. India has basically politically conquered the rest of South Asia. Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Sikkim, they're all gone, if you will, as autonomous states outside Indian power. China will not tolerate India dominating all of South Asia. The same way we wouldn't tolerate Germany or Russia controlling Europe or Japan controlling Asia. Because if a country controls the whole region, they turn their eyes to the next region, and that's China. So what did China do? They gave Pakistan the bomb. Very simple. And Pakistan with the bomb is like Israel having the bomb. The last thing the Americans want is to have to fight a war for Israel. The last thing China wants is to fight a war for Pakistan. Now, we didn't give Israel the bomb, they got it themselves, so there's a major difference there. But the outcome is one in which Americans like for Israel and the Chinese like for Pakistan, which means as long as Pakistan has the bomb, India's not going to attack it, so we got some stability there. So I don't worry.
Comment on the
We hear a lot about the corrupt Chinese. Question 2 first, and then question. We hear a lot about how corrupt the Chinese military is. There are two Chinese militaries. There are those that are in business and those that fight wars. And yes, this is a large section of this military is really in business making money. But with a military of 2.5 million people, you can sort of write them off as the other military. And that's what this country has done. They said, look, you know, we got a problem, but we're going to have our core that's out of military is going to train hard and be good soldiers. So in that respect, if you want to see a rise of Chinese power, you look at the land army. This is a much better, much more powerful military than it was 15 years ago. They're better trained, they've got better weapons, they got better education. This is a formidable land army. But I don't care about that because they can't swim to Singapore. If I was Vietnam, I'd worry. If I was Russia, I'd worry. Right? If I was Burma, I'd worry. But I'm not. I'm an American, so I don't worry. Right? Now, so what that does is it reinforces, if you will, the existing balance of power on the mainland of Chinese dominance, rather than change anything new. And what the Chinese have done in the last 6 months is said to the military, sell your businesses. Get out of business. Well, what do you do with all these people who are now unemployed in the military? They say, well, decommission them, take off the ranks, and they continue to work in the same factory as civilians. So they're accomplishing two things at once. They're getting rid of a bloated military. 3 million is far too strong. They'll come down to 2.5, and they'll get the military out of business. So they're doing a good job there. Second issue is the role of the military in politics. You know, it's a standard authoritarian system. You know, it's not a communist country. You know, I mean, there was someone a while back who was giving a speech to the Politburo, or to a large meeting, and he said, look, if anyone wants to go follow this guy, and he was known as sort of a left-wing communist, go ahead. Anyone thinks his policies will work, go ahead and go with him. Anyone want to go with him? No one wanted to go. It was a joke. It was so absurd that those policy alternatives had any merit that it was meant as a joke, and people laughed. Communism is dead. Of course it's dead. Have you ever wanted to buy anything made in a communist country? I mean, that you're willing to go into Bloomingdale's or Macy's and buy something made in China suggests it's not communist. It is capitalist. And the only sector of that entire society that works is the capitalist sector. And the major challenge this leadership has, and they set this out as their challenge, is to get rid of the other parts so the whole country becomes capitalist. That's what they want to do. So this is a standard authoritarian government here. And what does authoritarian government have a problem with? Legitimacy. You know, whether it's Pinochet's Chile, whether it's Saddam Hussein, you know, they're all alike. Some are better than others. This one's better than most, truth be known. But it's still a standard authoritarian government, single party. So what's the military's job? If you need them, to quell the masses. And because this is not a system with good institutions, right? Authoritarian states don't have strong institutions. The president of China doesn't depend on being the president for power. He depends on support, and so that support comes from the military. So then you ask, what does the Chinese military want? What's on their agenda that you've got to satisfy them for, to keep them on board? They only want two things. They want money, so they can have a strong military. They want to make sure that whoever's in charge can run the country and keep it stable. Because they don't want the country falling apart, instability, fragmentism, and they got to step in and do things and clean up the mess. If you can keep them satisfied in those two things, they're out of politics. That's about what you got. Standard third world dynamics. Yes, sir.
Why don't you worry about China invading its neighbors on land?
I come from a particular school of thought called realism. Right? And realism says countries go to war to achieve objectives. They don't go to war because they're nasty. They don't go to war because they're warlike. They go to war because they got a particular policy objective, and they haven't found an easier way to do it. So they're willing to spend more of their resources to get that policy objective, and war, of course, is expensive, and yet they want it badly enough, so they'll go to war to get it. What that means, if you want peace, peace is easy. You make one country so powerful that everyone else listens to it, so it doesn't have to go to war. And that's what you got on China's perimeter. China is so powerful in Indochina And it doesn't have to use war to get what it wants. How often do we go to war in Central America? We don't go to war very often. When we go to war, we're so powerful, we go to war to promote democracy. That's a luxury that most states can't afford. Or we go to war to get rid of a drug dealer. You know, what's his name? In Panama. You know, that's a luxury. Not many countries have that luxury. That's how powerful we are. And then the real times we go to war, like in Grenada, because the Russians are coming. Or Nicaragua, or because they're communist. We go to clean out our backyard. That's when most countries go to war, is to keep their sphere of influence clean. China doesn't have to do that. No country is there, and no country is challenging its presence, and so it doesn't have to. So why did Russia go to war and occupy Eastern Europe? That's a very good question. Does that make China a better, nicer country because it doesn't want to occupy and Russia did? No. Russia understood that if those countries weren't occupied, they'd leave their sphere of influence. And they'd go right into Germany and right into America because they'd be sucked in to their economic power. That's what the Marshall Plan was for, right? It was, we basically said to the Russians, you got a choice. You can get along with the Americans and then stay out of Eastern Europe and understand that as a result of that, these countries are going to drift into the American orbit, or you can have a sphere of influence, in which case you have to occupy, in which case we're going to have a Cold War. The Russians took the Cold War. China doesn't face that problem. It dominates without occupying because no one else is there. And it's not threatened that anyone else is coming because no one else is willing to expend the resources to fight a land war in Asia. We've been there and done that. One more question. Yes, ma'am.
Said anything about the people in power in China? What are they like?
What are they like? I don't know. How do we address that issue? Are they nice people? Are they moral people? They're good politicians. You don't rise to the top of any political system without being very good politicians. So these guys understand power. They speak to power. I guess the question we need to ask is, are they good at running a country? That's what we want to know. Are they a good leader? And what you're seeing up there are pragmatists. The fellow who's coming to the United States is coming to Washington next week, coming to Boston after that. His name is the Prime Minister of China, Zhu Rongji. He doesn't have time for ideology. He doesn't have time for principles. He says, I got a job to do. My job is to create real banks. My job is to get this country growing. My job is to feed the people. And I'm going to get it done. That's a hard job. Because he's got so many people who are working in this system who are on the government handout. So if you close down and just make this system more efficient, you're going to have 100 million unemployed in the streets of China. Not too many countries can handle that. But he says, I'm going to get this job done. And that's who he is. That's a leader we ought to be respectful of. He's got the right ideas. He's got ideas we like. He wants to do the right thing. He doesn't care about ideology. He speaks our language. He's a graduate of China's equivalent of MIT. He can think on his feet. He doesn't use cue cards. This is someone who can speak. And many of us were looking forward to his visit to the United States because he can speak to what's new about China. China's a big place. It's a complex country. There's a lot of things we don't like about China. We don't like that it's a single-party authoritarian state. We don't like that they throw dissidents in jail. We don't like that they're the other great power in Asia. But there's a lot of things we do like. We like that the human rights situation is improving rather than getting worse on a slow basis, but we like the trend. We like that capitalism is coming. We like that they're willing to accept certain things around the world. And he sort of represents that new trend, that new China. And so we were hoping that he would come to China, come to the United States, and give voice to that other part of China, the part we like, the part we don't like. That's not to say he would make the relationship all rosy. He would make it a little more nuanced and give a little balance. Right? I think most of us now are fairly pessimistic that that's going to happen because it's very difficult to persuade people of certain ideas when they've become so locked in to an attitude, and that's where Washington is right now. It's so locked into espionage and China threat that they're not going to hear that other China. And so one wonders whether or not this visit will really be any good whatsoever. Thank you.